Consistency. The National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine is a useful resource that provides information on all of the methods, as well as others. It also provides users with links so that they can read about the research supporting the effectiveness of these methods as well as others. It also provides users with links so that they can read about the research supporting the effectiveness of these methods. One thing that all of this research supports is the notion that to be truly effective, a person needs to pursue one of these methods consistently. They're all effective, therefore, the task facing you is to choose one and then stick with it. As an example, consider yoga. When one group of people who attend 8 yoga classes was compared to a second group who had been practicing yoga once a week for 2 years, it was found that both groups had reduced stress levels, but the second group had a significantly greater reduction in stress. So if you decide try to meditating, but you only meditate once a week for 3 weeks, don't expect a significant reduction in your stress or anxiety levels. On the other hand, if you practice meditation 5 or 6 times a week for several weeks, you should begin to notice an effect. Not that meditating is a cure for borderline personality disorder, but the fact is that free floating anxiety plagues many men with MBPD. It clouds their thinking, often leading them to make false conclusions. For example, that a loved one is rejecting them when that is not the case. By learning a technique that has been found to reduce stress and practicing it consistently, men with MPBD can put themselves in a position to cope more effectively with other issues such as insecurity. Because of free floating anxiety is so common among those with MBPD, I chose to begin with solutions, part of the book by addressing it first. Free floating anxiety is linked to insecurity. Though most men with BPD are not consciously aware of that connection, free floating anxiety can be attacked in two ways, beginning by connecting the dots between it and the inner insecurity that drives it. Men can use insight combined with a technique for taking stock and confronting their anxiety to question the legitimacy of their anxiety they're feeling. How much of it is based on current reality versus the portion of it that is just a ghost from the past. Men can also learn to reduce free floating anxiety by learning and consistently practicing one of the methods described in this chapter. By doing so, they will find they are better able to stop and think as opposed to reacting impulsively based on a false perception. Finding your voice. We have already seen that much of the behavior associated with borderline personality disorder operates on an unconscious level. For example, insecurity that is rooted in early experiences of rejection, abuse, abandonment is typically not connected in the mind of MPBD man with behaviors such as being thin skinned, hyper, or having a hair trigger temper, which is very, very like a minute hair trigger. Substance abuse turning to alcohol and other drugs to cope with negative feelings such as anxiety or depression. The man with BPD just doesn't connect the dots between early experience and his behavior as an adult. One reason is that those experiences may have occurred long ago and are largely forgotten. Research has shown, for example, that we are inclined to hold on to positive memories and forget negative ones that can cause us discomfort. In other words, human beings are susceptible to nostalgia. In cases of severe trauma, we may experience periodic flashbacks of for a long time, much of the rejection, abandonment, or abuse that can lead to insecurity and eventually to borderline personality disorder. However, is not so severe as to be traumatic. This is true in particular for people with mild to moderate borderline personality disorder. The bottom line then is that they are apt to forget those negative experiences over time and therefore fail to see the connection between those experiences and their current behavior. Men with borderline personality disorder are not a different species from men who do not have a borderline personality disorder. All men are capable of experiencing insecurity and free floating anxiety. All men are capable of feeling jealous and of being defensive at times. The difference for men with BPD is that the deep insecurity associated with MBPD leads these men to be hypervigilant and hypersensitive. Their borderline personality serves as an amplifier, causing their emotional responses to be more intense. So, a slight criticism or complaint from a loved one that might simply get a non personality disorder man's attention and make him momentarily uncomfortable can cause the man with borderline personality disorder to explode in rage, to fall into a deep depression, or self medicate with substance. In order to break the above cycle, the man with borderline personality disorder must learn to correct his perceptions. In effect, he needs to be able to turn the emotional amplifier off so that he can react to interactions as they are supposed to, reacting on the basis of exaggerated feelings of rejection or abandonment. This is not easy. The man with borderline personality disorder should expect to make slow progress as opposed to changing dramatically and quickly. On the other hand, progress is possible for borderline personality disorder man who is set to have a goal, the potential reward or significantly less anxiety, fewer hurt feelings, more satisfactory relationships, and self acceptance as opposed to self hatred. First step putting words to feelings. Learning to turn off your emotional amplifier involves two steps, and the first of these is learning to put feelings into words. Men with borderline personality disorder often act as if they are insanely angry, yet if were not realized, they are in fact angry. Similarly, they are often unable to name free floating anxiety for what it is or say that they are feeling the pain associated with abandonment or rejection. If you suggest that they are feeling abandonment or rejection, they may get defensive and deny it, as obvious as it seems. Lacking that insight, they are therefore at a loss as to what to do about such feelings so as to make themselves feel calmer and more secure. Interestingly, men with borderline personality disorder may not be hypersensitive or defensive in all situations. Rather, it is the context of their most intimate relationships that their emotional amplifier emerges. Here an example. Gary had decided to commit to counseling after quitting drinking for a period of 6 months. He had turned to 12-step program for support. Despite his initial skepticism, he found what he described as home there. I had the usual hesitation at first, he explained, like many of others. I suppose. I thought I'd find a bunch of burnouts and losers at 12-step meeting. Boy, I was surprised. I found a couple of men's meetings and quickly discovered that these guys weren't losers at all. In fact, a number of them were professionals like me. Gary was a CPA, certified public accountant, who was working for a law firm. His specialties included taxes and estate planning. He would work with one of those two lawyers in the firm who also specialized in those areas, helping mostly upper middle class individuals and couples plan ahead. Gary was divorced and had no children. Has been in this current relationship for 2 years. It was partly due to pressure from his girlfriend Rita that Gary started to thinking of alcohol. He concluded that he was no longer the occasional social drinker that he once was and that he wanted to quit, at least for a while. I wasn't thinking about quitting forever, he said, but after being abstinent for a couple of months, I felt so much better that I decided not to go back. It was also Rita who had suggested Gary give a 12-step program a try. She had two good friends, she said, who believed that 12-step program had transformed their lives. So, although Gary was not at all convinced he was addicted to alcohol, he decided to give the 12 steps a try. I knew I could use some support in quitting, he said, even if I wasn't a fully fledged addict. In truth, when he came for counseling, Gary still was not convinced that he was ever dependent on drinking, though he had no doubt that the comfort, support, and love he found in his 12-step program had made a big difference in his life. More than that, he'd become to realize that in many ways he'd sought that some same comfort from drinking. What surprised me most, he told me, was how he was accepting and supporting these people were. I think I expected them to be judgmental. One time, when I went to a meeting and said that I had a few drinks that night before after arguing with Rita, I half expected the group to kick me out. I was shocked, frankly, when they welcomed me with open arms. That one experience sealed the deal for me. With or without a label, I consider myself a member of my 12-step program. I attend two meetings a week, including my home group meetings, and I have a sponsor I talk to or several emails, email several times a week. Gary's expectations that he would be rejected or abandoned by 12-step program because he had a few drinks was part and parcel of his borderline personality disorder. He readily admitted that he was thin-skinned, that this had been a problem for him in all his situations. I'm not confident in myself at all, he explained. On some level, I just don't seem to believe that I'm smart enough, or good looking enough, or funny enough to keep a woman. I expected to be rejected, and I can sink into a depression at the drop of the hat. I asked Gary if he was the same way at the work as he was in his relationships. He laughed. Not at all, he replied. At work, I know I come across as confident because I am. If someone has a question about some figures on projections I have come up with, I have no problem explaining it. I never doubt myself. But in my relationships, it's totally different. Gary was dealing with some severe insecurity, though he did not recognize or label it as such. Rather than trying to put words to his feelings, when he was hurt, he would withdraw into himself and become sullen. Rita had witnessed this many times, and she attributed it to Gary being very defensive and sensitive to use her words. It was only after we spent some time talking about Gary's formative and Gary, but first Gary said he had a very little recollection of those years. To facilitate our discussion, I asked him if he possessed a family photo album or had some other ways of gaining access to pictures himself and his family as he was growing up. Many with many men with borderline personality have only one first memories of their childhood, while almost everyone had an imperfect memory. I believe this is even more or so for those with MPBD. I suspect this is because these people have desires to suppress those memories. Going through old photos is one way to help unlock those memories and get a picture of what it was like to be that person growing up. As it turned out, Gary did not have a family photo album, but his sister did. She was willing to lend it to him. I asked Gary to take some of time and to look through the album. Before we talked about it. He did so with Rita, and the next time he came to see me, we had a very fruitful discussion. Here is what Gary said. As a child, beginning when I was about 10, I put on a lot of weight, so much that my pediatrician had diagnosed me as obese and advised my mother to restrict my food intake. especially snacks. She did nothing of the kind. Rather, she seemed determined to keep me fat. She was quite overweight herself, as as was my sister. Naturally, I got picked on in school. I was terrible at sports. The class I hated most was gym, the class that all the other boys liked the best. I'm the only one in my family who ever lost that weight starting in high school. It might be hard to believe, but I actually got criticized for that at home, for not eating enough. I can only remember one time when my father hit me, and I remember that afterward he came to my room and said he was sorry. My mother, though, slapped me often. My father never did anything about that. My mother always said that I was a difficult child, but I don't know in what way I was difficult. She complained many times that as an infant I was colicky and kept her awake all night. How was I responsible for that? I was an infant. But to listen to her, you didn't think I did it on purpose? Growing up, it was always clear to me that my sister was my mother's favorite, and I never could figure out why that was either. I remember one Christmas when she got at least three times the gift I did. When I asked my mother, how come Ma- Murray got so many more presents, my mother just laughed and said, because I love her more. She said it's like she was making a joke, only it wasn't a joke to me.